Hello friends, welcome to StudyIQ. Today we would be discussing the implications of banning Chinese goods in an international relations perspective. This has been going on in the media for a long time now. So let's understand the nuances of this particular debate that is going on. So these are the products that we at StudyIQ offer to all of the students at really good prices. And the latest update has been the test series of UPSC being made available in Hindi to cover as many students as possible. Now, what is happening? So at this stage, there is a standoff between India and China in the Sikkim border. So there are a lot of issues with respect to the territorial claims by both China and India, and it's basically related to the way we interpret and they interpret all the accords that have been signed by erstwhile British Empire and then the Chinese Empire as well. So at this juncture, there has been a lot of discourse in India that we have to ban Chinese goods, and then that's how we'll have to take our own revenge, or that's how we have to get back at them. What they're doing is wrong, etc. And then we'll have to put pressure on China, especially considering that they are basically forcing us to sort of resort to something really violent, etc. So, and then this is not the first time. In 2 years' time, this is the second time that's happening. And before this, the same kind of discourse happened when we were trying to sort of get the Jaish-e-Mohammed chief Masood Azhar designated as terrorist by the United Nations. China sort of said no, 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 and then China vetoed this particular decision or this particular claim of ours. So let's analyze what we are talking in the first place. So while people are trying to come up with such claims, do such claims hold any sort of weight? So let's understand the weight part of it. So what are we talking something tangible? So on that note, yes, at the face of it, I mean when you look at the amount, the claim doesn't seem all that invalid, because the trade that we have with China is somewhere worth around 60 billion, and at this stage when we look at the deficit alone is around 50 billion. So which means we are buying 50 billion worth of goods from them unilaterally. So this does mean something to them, or this should mean something to them. Having said all this, the social media campaign this time could not sort of bring the government to sort of answer or to give a response, unlike last time when we were trying to lobby for the terrorist stamp on Masood Azhar. But again, last year, going by what the Commerce Minister said last year, she said that she made it really really clear that it is not possible for us to put a blanket ban on Chinese products due to WTO rules. Now we'll get to that later, but then this is the stand of the Commerce Minister last year, and it doesn't really differ now going by the way things look at this stage. Moving in, let's understand a few lines by the Commerce Minister, just to understand the pulse of the issue. So just because we may not like certain things about a country, it's not a reason enough to block imports from that country. We could impose anti-dumping duties, but there are established ways to go about it, and dumping has to be proved. She told the reporters here, responding to a query. So when we look at this shows the complexity of the relationship we share with China in the presence of a lot of international organizations. So when I say international organizations, I mean WTO, United Nations, etc. And considering we are a sovereign nation, but it somehow has been the case that such international organizations are regulating our decisions, and in a way it is very important also, because otherwise a strong nation would mean an arbitrarily deciding authority, which is not good for the world order. So we'll have to understand the presence and the relevance of WTO or United Nations in this context. So moving on, again there are again these two quotes by the Minister of Commerce, Ms. Nirmala Sitharaman, on how anti-dumping cannot necessarily be levied on Chinese products, because it can only be specifically on a given few products where dumping has been proved, but it can't be across the board. So the mechanisms that we have are only to sort of ward off abnormalities, and not necessarily a blanket ban where the trade is happening in correct terms or in right terms. And there is a trivia here. The anti-dumping duty is always levied by the Directorate General of Anti-Dumping and Allied Duties, which comes under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. And Ministry of Finance also has a part to play in this, but then the recommendations and the implementation, most of it is being done only by the Directorate General of Anti-Dumping and Allied Duties under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Moving on, the counter view here. Well-known geostrategist, Professor Brahmachalane, he said that India should use its weapon called trade against China. So this is the view that this is something that has gained a lot of traction. If you Google Chinese products ban and one of the first results is Professor Brahmachalane's argument as to how we can use or how big our trade is, and how this can act as one of the most important tools against countering China. Moving on, it's not just the professor, there are many other people who have a lot of things to say, and let's consider Baba Ramdev, one of the most important entrepreneurs in India through his Patanjali range of products. So he said China has to step back this time. If we boycott Chinese products, then China will have to rub its nose and bend before India. Now this is a little too far-fetched. So let's see how much truth this holds in a way. So could China do the banning? So we are considering a ban now, or at least though when I say we, a good chunk of Indians are considering a ban now. So let's see if China could do this banning, because considering China also is a little touchy about its own sovereignty, and considering they have the one China policy and all of this, because the relationship that it has with many countries are a little strained. So let's see if a country like China could do the banning when it got a chance to. So yes, it was reported that the South Korean example. South Korea had gone ahead and signed the THAAD missile system agreement with the US. So at that point of time, Beijing slapped a ban on Korean cosmetics. So how this was done was, by banning Lotte, South Korean retail giant Lotte, from operating in the country. So this sort of put pressure on Seoul, Korean capital, and then it wanted South Korea to abandon the THAAD system, which it considered a threat to its national security. So again, this missile system, we know how US also wants to counter Chinese belligerence and possible Chinese development. So this happens worldwide. So if one country is trying to grow beyond, or if the growth of one country is seen as a threat by another, there are mechanisms put. It's a very old concept, but it's a very relevant concept yet. It's one of the most basic elements of international relations, and then peace and security, world order, etc. So, but then China did not acknowledge the bans on tourism. There were also bans reported on tourism, but this information was gathered through their tour operators, who said that Chinese government put pressure on them with respect to not allowing tours to South Korea, or so this was how it was done, so that the tourists that go from China to South Korea, the moment you stop there are quite a few of them that go, which is also, tourism is always one of the most profitable industries, considering the forward and backward linkages that it can have. Every tourist location involves 100 businesses or 100 entrepreneurs at least. That's exactly why India also has the heritage link. India has been investing a lot into tourism of late. And next, Mongolian Trucks. So Dalai Lama visited Mongolia, and then in December 2016, the Chinese also sort of pressurized Mongolia. While when the Mongolian government tried to welcome Tibetan spiritual leader Dalai Lama. So China warned them before, but then Mongolia believed in religious freedom, and eventually China blocked hundreds of Mongolian trucks carrying coal crossing Chinese border. So this affected Mongolia in a very bad manner, because coal is one of the primal sources of energy, and coal trade in coal, irrespective of the country importing it or exporting it, is one of the important aspects of trade between countries. because of its energy relevance. So this is this is something that you could mention in your answers. So China's Sun Tzu style strategy, diplomacy and military pressure, as well as soft and hard tactics, will go hand in hand. So I can even give you an example. When the Chinese premier came to India to meet our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, there were also incursions in the border, and there were a few infiltrations, etc. So Chinese, and even if you go back, when Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and Mao had a long conversation, which was recently declassified somewhere in the year 1954, China was very particular about their Tibetan strategy and considering Tibet to be Chinese territory. So one of these conversations was recently declassified, and it shows as to how Mao sort of tactically placed a friendly hand on one side and also a stern hand on the other. So even while we were in the Panchashil phase, China was always keen on the carrot and stick approach. So while they are being friendly on one hand, while they are being transactional on one hand, they also are a little stern on the other. So their friendly hand is always does always come with a condition. Even with respect to Pakistan, for that matter, where they are planning to invest 46 billion, the China-Pakistan economic corridor that we are very worried about. Even their investment, if you actually go to the nuances of that particular investment, you would see that most of their investment is in the form of loans, and even where they are not, the investments are in a way that expect Pakistan people also to sort of give something in return. For example, they talk about special economic zones being constructed, but then such special economic zones come with a condition of not having labor laws there, or tax holidays, etc. So we need to understand the nature of Chinese investments, whatever place it be. So it's always this particular carrot stick approach that they always follow. And Sun Tzu is the person who's written a book called The Art of War. It's a very small book, and if you guys find time, I think you should read it to understand the nuance between how a Chinese diplomat or a Chinese foreign policy thinker would think. It still holds a given amount of relevance even in today's world. Moving on, how big is our trade? Let's talk numbers. So China-Pakistan economic corridor is somewhere worth around 46 billion, the investment. But then India's import from China was 58 billion, and then export to China was merely 11 billion. So somewhere around a little more than what they're investing in China-Pakistan economic corridor is our trade deficit every year. So this is what Professor Brahma Chalane was trying to highlight, and then talk that if we are almost giving them money to make one China-Pakistan economic corridor every year, to them. So that's the kind of profit that they are. That's the kind of difference in the balance of payments that we have. That's the deficit that we have with respect to China. And this deficit has been increasing as a percentage and in absolute terms over the past few years. So which is worrying. But is the answer stopping? Does the answer lie in banning Chinese goods? Well, let's look at it in a more detailed manner. Now, how do we minimize the deficit? So the idea is to not ban them per se, because we are also dependent on their goods, which will be covered in the later slides. But then the only way to go about it is to also put up a fight. It's not to sort of call the fight off, or it's not to sort of stop engaging with them. It's to engage with them in a more productive or even in a more profitable manner. So while trade deficit, has been is 51 billion now, there has been an agreement which India signed for bilateral trade balance. So it was a 5-year program which was signed in 2014, and its objective was to make sure the trade relationship that we have is mutually beneficial to us. So in a way, sort of making sure how India can improve its exports, and how China can sort of ration its imports, that can sort of balance out, or foreign exchange strategies, all of this. So this was one of the positive agreements that India and China has had in the recent past, and which should be tapped into. And now it's 2017. Now it's almost been 3 years. But if we look at the trend, it's only been increase or rise in deficit both in absolute terms and as a percentage. So a good starting point could be to revisit this entire agreement that we have, considering it's been 3 years. So to go back and then sort of see how this can be brought in, make sure the time lost is made up, and how to sort of make sure we benefit through this agreement, or even extend this agreement so that the trade is mutually beneficial. And moving on, how do we sort of, when we were talking about putting that agreement in place, we'll have to support our exports in a way, or we have to improve our exports in a way wherein there is more value addition. At this stage, the exports from India are mostly raw materials, or which have very minimal value addition. But then there are a few areas where there can be value addition, and suddenly, if you see, with almost 10% effort, there can be almost 30, 40 or 50% value addition, which will balance out the trade deficit that we have. So the export basket that we have to China, so raw materials like cotton, iron ore, copper, which have been a hallmark of Indian exports, have come under increasing scrutiny, because the exporters try to shift priorities towards value added products. So the point here being, we have to move towards value added products. So just iron ore, so just cotton, just copper, these do not yield much in terms of money to the exporter. So the more value addition, the more is the profit margin. And the same has been echoed by the commerce minister, wherein she said that the export focus should shift away from raw materials. And then the ministry has also identified hardware, electronics, pharmaceuticals, textiles, and automobile components. So an interesting point here is that China's labor, in China, the cost of labor has been increasing over the years. That's exactly why they have been putting a lot of their money into R&D, research and development of a lot of robotics or automated labor, etc., or artificial intelligence for that matter. And this needs a lot of time to sort of come to fruition, and it's not always possible to completely mechanize any given production cycle. So India has an advantage here, and China is also on at a later stage of demographic dividend, where they are not able to, where China also has an aging population because of their own population policies, etc. So at this juncture, India can sort of tap into its labor market. It's considering there is a lot of skilling happening, though we have our own problems with skilling. So if skilling is channelized in a way that our workforce is competent enough, we can tap into the markets of hardware, electronics, textiles, and automobile components. And with respect to pharmaceuticals, we all know that India is one of the biggest hubs of generic medicine, and generic medicine will also provide China with with access to cheap medicines, but quality medicines, which don't necessarily run on patents, etc. And and when I say cheap medicines, I don't mean cheaper in terms of quality, but it's just that there is no patent cost, which which in most of the cases adds up to the cost of a medicine. So a simple example could be a medicine with patents could cost somewhere around 100 rupees, but a medicine without patent will just cost you somewhere around 5 or 6 rupees to make. So this is the kind of change that one could see once the patent goes off, and once the generic medicines are pumped in. So these are very possible avenues that we can tap in, and it's not something that needs a lot of effort from India. It just needs some channeling and some foresight while we are tapping into this. And this is to give you guys an idea as to how, when I said the trade deficit is increasing both in terms of absolute numbers and as a percentage. So if you see, the trade deficit is in yellow. So it was 36 crore of 51 crore, and then it was 48 of 60, 52 of 61, and again 51 of 61. So in absolute terms and as a percentage, the deficit is increasing. So this needs to be tapped in. So while I'm talking about moving away from our export basket and then trying to sort of give them something which has more value addition, and so this essentially would balance this yellow and sort of make it to a given to a considerable amount which can be handled. Again, we can't expect we at this stage we can't expect India to have a favorable balance of trade. When I say a favorable balance, exports are more than imports, and an unfavorable balance of trade is imports are more than exports. So we can't expect to have a favorable balance of trade, because to be I mean to talk facts, India is more dependent on Chinese products at this stage for cost matters, or for their quality, and for many other reasons. So, for example, our Digital India scheme also depends on China for quite some, because of availability of cheaper goods and more quality goods, etc. And in a way, China is also considered the manufacturing hub of the US, so which also talks about their quality. So we can't expect a favorable balance of trade. We can expect a near unfavorable balance where we have a given amount of deficit. So even big countries, it also is the case with big countries where they have an unfavorable balance of trade. An unfavorable balance of trade is not necessarily bad, but it needs to be within given limit. So which is also just like inflation. Let's say a given amount of inflation is important or is necessary to drive consumption. On the same note, a given amount of deficit with respect to balance of trade is still fine, as long as we have our foreign exchange reserves, because we are at the end of it we are dependent on one another. So we have good favorable balance of trade with a lot of other countries, where we export a lot. So a few small countries in the Southeast Asia, in Africa, etc. Moving on, market economy status. So this is one of the technical aspects of this particular issue. So market economy status is given under WTO. So this has also been raised in the academic circles as to what if this comes up. So this is one of the less nationalistic arguments and more to do with academic arguments, which comes out and says, what about the market economy status that China gets? So let's simplify market economy status now. So once a country gets market economy status, its exports are to be accepted at the production cost or the selling price as the benchmark. So I'll give you an example. Let's say China is producing 1 kilo steel for 10 rupees and India is producing 1 kilo steel for 15 rupees. The production cost might be the same in India and China. So even China might be producing it at 15 and India also might be producing it at 15. But what if, considering China as the manufacturing hub and China has a lot of government support, what if that 10 rupees that China is selling at the difference of 5 rupees is given through government subsidies, and it's able to now sell at 10 rupees even in China or in India? So what the government does is, the government will not take into consideration or the importing country, or let's say India, once we are trying to import it from China, what we'll do is, so we are producing it at 15, you are producing it at 10. So what will happen is, when you are coming to India, there is an anti-dumping duty or a countervailing duty of 5 rupees. So that it is also equally 15 rupees. So that we are giving a level playing field to the Indian producer and the Chinese producer. So now it all depends on your marketing ability. Now you have a level playing field, so just try to sell your products. This is how we do it with a non-market economy. But with a market economy, what will happen is, we will have to agree to the price at which China produces, or China says it's producing, its selling price. Let's say selling price tag has 10 rupees. So once they get a market economy status, we can't sort of say no to that 10, or we can't not recognize that 10. So this is the problem. So under WTO norms, the importing countries are allowed to use alternative methodologies for non-market economy. But then for market economy status, you will have to use their selling price or production cost as the benchmark. So if China produces it at 10 and we produce it at 15, we have to allow the imports to happen at 10 only, which will mean our domestic markets will be subjected to a lot of competition and some unhealthy competition. This is the problem with the market economy status. Moving on, when China joined the WTO on 11 December 2001, it was written that they will get the market economy status in 2016, in 15 years. And once they upgrade to being a market economy per se, because the problem that the WTO recognized back then with China was government interferes a lot with the production and with factors of production and the way things are produced and the prices being set. So a lot of subsidization, a lot of subsidy is being given to make sure there is some export competitiveness. And it's obvious that China doesn't acknowledge such subsidization. And it was also promised, and of course, when you're going to consider such big an economy as a non-market economy, any country would not want to sign a deal. But then China was told that in 15 years, you will be sort of given the status of a market economy, and then there were many different ways in which countries tried to sort of rationalize the prices of Chinese goods. And at this stage, considering it's 2016 is already passed, and now is the time to sort of give China the market economy status. But once China gets its market economy status, it will be really difficult to impose anti-dumping duties, or it will really become difficult to impose import tariffs and all of that. And this will have an impact on the Indian markets, the Indian domestic manufacturing market, or the Indian domestic production market. And these questions are not just raised by us, but then by a lot of other countries, because even they are aware of the Chinese potential, and then the possible disruption that it could cause in their own internal markets. Moving on, how dependent are we? So let's not forget that we are also dependent on China, and then trade is always bilateral, and it's a two-way process, etc. So a business deal only happens when there are needs on both sides. So this is the basic tenet that we need to keep in mind. And various reports on India-China trade suggest that we are heavily dependent on computer hardware, power generation equipment, steel, electronic components, consumer electronics, and electrical machinery. So most of our phones that we use today, be it Micromax or all these Indian phones, Indian brands or the foreign brands. So a lot of phones that we use today, like Mi, OnePlus, and all of these brands, and even Apple for that matter. Apple, though the money. So let's not take Apple into consideration. But then the phones like Mi and OnePlus, Oppo, Vivo, all these phones are from China. The low priced Android phones that give you a good feature set. And then even the phones like Micromax and all these companies, Indian companies, are either importing it from Korea or China, most of them. So, and more importantly, Chinese power generation equipment is one thing that we'll have to be really really watchful about, because their power generation equipment is cheap, and which also has a bearing on our power generation costs. So cheaper machinery means cheaper power. Cheaper power means proliferation of power throughout the country. So which means our idea of powering up India with electricity and energy is also dependent on Chinese imports. So until we find an alternative to this, we will have to be a little wary about the idea of banning Chinese products altogether. So this idea of putting nation first should be a very thoughtful one. So we are putting our nation first when we are talking about importing goods from China. So the moment someone says let's import goods from China, while everybody else is shouting on the other side saying let's not import goods from China, this guy who's talking about importing goods is also a nationalist, is also a patriot, because he's also looking at the country's welfare, development, etc. And trying to shun this guy as anti-national doesn't make sense, because even the government of the day is very, very conscious about this. And then going by the words of the commerce minister, we are also sure about what the government is thinking, and the government is thinking right in terms of not giving a blanket ban. So where there is dumping, we give them duties. We sort of talk to them about it, and then we make sure there are duties in place. But a blanket ban doesn't make sense. Moving on a broader note, and there is another academician who said if we want to cut down our import from China, we will have to improve our manufacturing capabilities and look for alternative markets to compensate the trade. So even a stand like this doesn't completely exclude China. So what he's saying is this is a more pro ban stand, but this doesn't talk about a blanket ban, because a improving our manufacturing in India will take a lot of time. Now it'll at least take a good 5 to 6 years, because all of the infrastructure has to be set up, the skilling has to happen, and then comes production, and then alternative markets to compensate the trade. So we'll have to look at markets where we can export more, so that we have foreign exchange, and then sort of balance this out here. Because coming up with capital goods industries, or coming up with investment in manufacturing takes investment in industry and manufacturing takes a lot of time to sort of bear fruits. So any plan on that note will be medium or long term. So we will have to sort of make sure this these ideas of banning goods are well thought out before putting them out in public. Moving on, is Baba right? Well, not really, because when he said that, if you go back and see, he said China will be on its knees, it will come lick its nose, etc. But then not really, because China's trade with US is close to 400 billion, and with Hong Kong it's 300 billion, and in Japan it's somewhere 150 billion, and our trade deficit is 50 billion, and our trade is 60 billion. So even if we boycott or ban bilateral trade worth rupees 60 or 70 billion, let's say, it will necessarily not affect China. It can be a bargain chip at this stage, and say ki if what if we stop, but this should not be pushed further, because it will only increase the hostility that we have. At best, what it will do is to sort of scare China for a little, because there will be money shocks. Of course, no matter how big a businessman or how big a country you are, any change will affect you for a while, but then after that you will want to overcome it. And this is not necessarily a trade in the volume that's happening with the US, like let's say 400 or 300 billion, but this is just 50 billion. So the shock will be for a while, but they will also try to recuperate. And once they recuperate, the hostility is already established. So how do we undo the hostility? So if we want to go back and talk to China also, but then what would they say? You put us into trouble, so we will also pay you back, in a given way. So this idea of banning trade, I don't know, this can be used as a bargaining chip, but only at the last resort also. So, but this idea is not a very healthy idea, even in the national interest, because we've seen a lot of Chinese incursions. So what we can do is, the official trade might stop, but the unofficial trade will go on, or the black market will go on, and then there's hostility, there'll be incursions, and all of this to sort of put pressure on India one way or the other. And sanctions. So the world has seen a lot of sanctions by the US mostly, and by the EU, and these are being imposed mostly on Russia and North Korea. So, but what has it done to Russia or North Korea? Russia has always moved away from the US sanctions and tried to fend for itself. It has made sure it's seen new markets, but the hostility is not gone down yet. And even with respect to North Korea, so irrespective of the number of sanctions, North Korea still is a threat to the US, or the world at large. It's just a loose cannon. So the moment, so a sanction or a ban, or things on these lines are just means to cut engagement. The moment you stop engaging with another country, it would seriously hamper the ability of a given country to change their perspective. So let's say A and B are fighting. If one stops talking, the and 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 what would B do? B would obviously go to another person to talk. It's not necessarily that uh, it's not necessary that the fight will go down. And going by the examples that we've seen in the past, the countries have always tried to look at other countries as markets, as opposed to the ones that have put sanctions, but the engagement has not happened at all. The engagement, or no country has gone back on their knees and said, oh yeah, please sort of take us in, I'm sorry, etc. So uh, with respect to Ukraine, Russia and Korea are the examples that I can think of. So these sanctions, or the idea of sanctions, have not paid off in the long run. So with respect to with respect to trade that we have with China, we have with China, and then the dependency that we have with respect to the trade of China, and also the sensitive border that we share. When we take these three, the amount of trade that we are having, two, the seriousness or the dependency that we have with respect to Chinese trade, and three, the sensitive border issues that we have. And even the fourth parameter could be our traditional stance of being a non-violent nation, or being a very composed nation, not a non-violent. When I say non-violent, I don't mean a weak nation. In fact, I believe, or a lot of people believe, or the country believes per se, that non-violence is the virtue of the brave. We are one of the most bravest of nations on that note. And like Gandhiji says, non-violence is only possible if you are brave. So going by these four parameters, resorting to something like a blanket ban or a sanction is not what India would do, or is not what India would want to do, or is not what India should be thinking of. And then the bigger picture, because as I promised, this would be a more international relations based presentation. So at a time when US is backtracking, there is a lot of churning within US with Trump coming in, and then the global leadership, with respect to global leadership role, US is not as composed as it was before, and the European Union is struggling with a series of exit plans or internal crises, starting from the Cyprus pigs economies, and then the German emergence, and then the Brexit. All of this, and then the European has a sluggish growth inside. So with these two in picture, any sort of an alternative that can be provided could either be from Russia, or from China, or from India. So these three nations. So let's say BRICS, in a way. So Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, of which Russia, China, and India are big countries. So in the wake of such a seemingly visible power transition, any military escalation will just take us back 10 steps. So we've sort of built our way, we sort of worked hard to sort of reach this situation over the past 60 to 70 years. So one small military incursion, or one small military, a military engagement will just take us back, even if it's not in terms of physical or human casualties. It will take us back in terms of economy or trade, etc. So at this stage, while we are trying to look at the bigger picture, we will have to be more composed, and there is a lot of responsibility on us, considering we are involving in a lot of confidence building measures with the Southeast Asian economies. We are exporting, considering now we are a part of MTCR. Now we are exporting our missiles to Vietnam. Defense trade is happening, which is positive for us, and all of this, while this is happening, India is making money, and being a more resilient nation. The IORA, Indian Ocean Rim Association of Nations, and then BRICS and BIMSTEC, all of these. So there is a given amount of clout that India has, and there's a given amount of stature that India has now. So it can't sort of afford to dilute that over a struggle with China. So, and even China is trying to build itself up. So while this is happening at this stage, at a very nascent stage of becoming a solid nation or a solid country in the world, we can't afford to miss an opportunity to grow at the cost of a few at the cost of some pressure. So in the end, given the weight that these two Asian giants carry in the world politics, any adventurism could be an expensive one. So this is one line that I've found to be very, very composed and very practical, very pragmatic in a way. So this is how I would think of ending an answer written for a question on these lines. And again, I'd want to end with two quotes. One by Thomas E. Schelling, which said, "Threats in international politics is a serious business." Yes, this has been proven over and again. So over one single thread, we've seen big wars break out. Over one single thread, we've seen a lot of money lost. Over one single thread, we've seen economies being shut forever, etc. And lastly, by Chanakya, there is some self-interest behind every friendship. There is no friendship without self-interest. This is the bitter truth. So when I talk about friendship, I'm talking about the bilateral relationship between India and China. So yes, we can't necessarily sort of hope for China to be really good with us, really benevolent, etc. So at the end of it, we are on a transactional engagement, and all we have to do is to push our side of the transaction more rather than cutting the engagement altogether. So with this, I would want to sort of end this particular class. I hope you liked the video and this video of good use to you. If there are any doubts, please write to us, and thank you very much for your time.